Hey guys, welcome back to the campfire. I have another awesome story to share with you tonight. So when I was a kid, I used to love reading this book called Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which is this really, frankly, not kid-friendly, scary story book that's marketed for kids, but it's like terrifying. The stories in there are like, they kept me up at night. I mean, they were really disturbing stories. They were fictional, but they rocked me as a kid. And when I read the story I'm going to share with you tonight, it just really brought me back to that feeling I got when I used to read those stories as a child. This story tonight feels like it belongs in that book, except tonight's story is not fiction like the book was. This is a true story. But before we get into tonight's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to water the follow button's plants the next time they go away for a long weekend, but instead of using water, use bleach. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. One summer night in the 1970s, a young woman named Hannah was sitting next to her husband at a blackjack table inside of the Genting Highlands Casino, which was this huge casino in central Malaysia. The room they were in was bright, it was loud, there was people everywhere, there's cigarette smoke hovering in the air, lots of drinking and chatting and laughing and gambling. And so as Hannah is sitting in this environment, she was doing her best not to let her nerves get the best of her, but she couldn't help it. I mean, she was really feeling anxious because her husband had just bet all their chips on this one hand. So her husband had been dealt his 2 cards, and they totaled 19, which was basically good, because in blackjack, you're trying to get to 21. You want your cards in total to equal 21, but you don't want to go over, or you bust, you lose. And so 19 is pretty good, but you're playing really against the dealer. And so basically it's between you and the dealer, who can get closest to 21 without going over. So the dealer had 2 cards, one was face up and one was face down. The face up card was a 10, and so Hannah is anxiously waiting to see this other card flipped over, just praying it's not a 10, because that would give him 20, and that would beat, her husband's 19, and they would lose. And so the dealer, he flips over this other card, and it's a 4. So now he's got 14, and so that's good. It means Hannah and her husband, they're still in the lead here. But the dealer will keep on hitting, so adding more cards to the pile here, adding to their total score, until they either hit 17 at least, or until they beat you, or until they bust. So they're going to keep on drawing more cards. And so the dealer draws another card, he puts it face down, and it's an 8. And so now collectively, the dealer has 22, they've gone over 21, they've busted, and Hannah and her husband have won. And so Hannah, she turns to her husband and she's overjoyed. I mean, they've just gambled all their money and they've won. I mean, this is a huge win. And Hannah and her husband, they didn't really come from money here. I mean, they're very modest people. They had saved up money for this trip. They had really wanted to come to this casino for a long time. And now it was like their luck was just incredible. They're having this unbelievable run. They had won a bunch of money beforehand, and now they had just won this hand and they doubled their money. Like, this is incredible. And so at this point, Hannah and her husband, they take all their chips, they leave the blackjack table. Everyone's like so excited for them, like the energy is awesome. And so Hannah and her husband, they make their way over to the cashier and they cash all their chips. They get all this cash. And Hannah's talking to her husband, like, this is awesome. Like, we were gonna have to drive home tonight. Let's get a room here. Let's use some of this money and like stay at the lavish hotel they have. Maybe we can go back to the casino tomorrow. Let's make a vacation out of this. But after cashing all their chips, Hannah's husband, he didn't seem too inclined to go spend the money on a hotel room or a restaurant or whatever. He told her, he's like, I don't know, like, I feel really lucky. Like, I'm on a roll here. I don't want to just like be done. I think I should go play slots and try to win a little bit more money. I think we can win more money. And Hannah's like, are you crazy? Like, this is the most money we've ever won ever. Like, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. If we stay and continue to gamble, we're just going to lose the money. Like, let's take the win. Let's get the hotel room. Let's just do that. But Hannah's husband, he was not having it, and he literally just took their money and was like, no, I'm gonna go do slots now. and he walked over to a slot machine. And Hannah's like, oh my God. She follows her husband over to the slot machine, and before long, he's playing the slots, and it's not going well. And Hannah's trying to convince him to stop, but he wouldn't have it, and he was so committed, he just kept going and going. And wouldn't you know it, after 2 hours of this, all the money was gone. Well, actually, it was not entirely all gone. He still had a little bit of money that they had intentionally set aside just to cover the hotel, because they needed a place to stay that night, and they had stayed later at the casino. And so literally they are down to just enough to stay in the hotel. And so at this point, Hannah, she's already accepted that they've lost all their winnings. And she's telling her husband, like, please, let's just walk away. Let's use this money. Let's just stay in the hotel. It is what it is. And they're about to leave when her husband's like, one more, turns around, puts it in the slot machine, pulls the lever, lose. Now they literally have no money. They have actually no more money. They can't get a hotel. It's the middle of the night, late. They have nowhere to stay. And now they have to drive home. And the drive is going to be awful. Like, Hannah is furious with her husband. Her husband feels like, oh, it's just bad luck. It's not my fault. But Hannah's like, it is your fault. You should have left. So it's just this awful, awful exit from the casino. Like, this is about to be the worst ride home ever. About 20 minutes later, Hannah was sitting in the passenger seat and her husband was driving, and they're cruising down this road. It's the middle of the night. They've passed no cars as they're driving. They're in this desolate stretch on their way back to their home. And, as expected, this has been a treacherous ride so far. They fought at the beginning, and now they're not talking. And so they're driving along, and Hannah's just looking out the window at all the trees. It's very jungly and swampy off to the side on either side of the road, and they're driving along. And at some point, as Hannah is just desperate to get home, she just wants to go to bed. She doesn't even care about the money at this point. She just literally wants to get in her bed. They're driving along when the car starts to sputter, like it's running out of gas. And immediately Hannah looks over at her husband like, are you kidding me? And her husband's looking over at her like, knowing that he's going to bring even more wrath down on himself from his wife. And he's just like, I'm sorry, like, I didn't know it was that low. Like, I didn't know the tank was that low. And before long, he had to pull over on the side of the road because their car was out of gas. Like, they couldn't go any farther. And so Hannah, as the car has come to a stop on the side of the road, she just looks at her husband and she's like, wow. Like, this night really couldn't get any worse. Like, are you kidding me? We are stranded in the middle of nowhere. We got no money. What are we going to do? And so Hannah's husband, he obviously knew this was not good. Like, he knows he's the one that was supposed to put gas in the car, and he didn't. He's sort of been the architect behind this whole disaster of a night here with his decision to keep on gambling. And so he just says to Hannah, look, you stay here. Just stay in the car. I have a gas can. I'll just walk to the nearest gas station. I'll get some gas. I'll bring it back. I'll fill it up. We'll be home soon. We can't be that far away anyways. Like, it can't be that far away. So just stay here. I'll go get gas. And so Hannah's like, okay, fine. Go get gas. And so Hannah just stays in the car, and her husband gets out. He goes in the back of the car. He gets the gas can. And then before long, Hannah watches as her husband walks ahead of the car and disappears into the darkness. And so after Hannah's husband has walked off, she knows it's going to be at least, 30, 40 minutes, before he gets gas and comes back. And, she's exhausted. And so she makes sure all the doors are locked, and then she leans back her seat and she just tries to go to sleep. And pretty quickly she does doze off. But then at some point, maybe 5-10 minutes later, she just kind of inexplicably wakes up. There was no reason why she woke up. She just opened her eyes, and she, for a second was a little bit disoriented. When you fall asleep for a few minutes like that, you'll kind of wake up like, what just happened? She's disoriented, and she remembered, oh, that's right. We had this horrible night. The casino went horribly. We ran out of gas. So that's right. Like, I'm living out this nightmare. Okay, now I know where I am. And so after getting her bearings, Hannah just rolled over in her seat and tried to go back to sleep. But this time, after closing her eyes, after just a few seconds, she heard this loud thumping noise on the roof of the car. And it was loud enough that she opened her eyes back up, and, there's no sunroof or anything, so she couldn't see what it was. And it was so dark outside, and there were no streetlights out there, that she couldn't just look out the window and see what it was. But she knew her husband could not possibly be back yet, and even if he was, why would he be banging on the roof? But then she remembered they had parked right next to this jungly, swampy area, just right off the side of the road. And, there were probably some low-hanging branches, and it was entirely possible that the wind had caused a branch to just bang against the roof of the car. And so that's what she assumed it was, and after realizing that, she just got comfortable again and closed her eyes. But then a few seconds later, she heard another thump on the roof of the car. And again, she instinctively looked out the window, and she's sort of like trying to figure out what it is, but she can't see anything. There's no sign of her husband walking up the road. There's nothing. And so again, she just tells herself, okay, again, it's just got to be this branch. But then after hearing it a second time, the thumping sound, it began to sort of persist. It's not super loud, but it's pretty consistent. It's like a thumping sound on the roof of the car. And it did basically sound like a branch hitting the roof, but it's just a nuisance. And more than anything, she's just frustrated because it's loud enough that she's not going to be able to sleep. And so she's not frightened by it. She's a little bit, unnerved by it perhaps because it's the middle of the night. She's all alone. But for the most part, she's just like, oh, great. Now I can't sleep. And so she's just sitting in her car and the thumping is continuing and she's just staring straight ahead. And she knew, she was sort of being a little cowardly. She figured I probably should just get out and just confirm this really is a branch. But there was just some part of her that's like, I am in the middle of nowhere. It's the middle of the night. It's a little bit creepy, so I'm not going to do that. So she's just looking straight ahead, really waiting for her husband. And so thump, thump, thump. She's just looking straight ahead. And then a little while later, she doesn't see her husband, but she sees headlights appear that are coming in her direction. And to this point, she hadn't seen a single other car since they had been on this road, basically, or at least since they had pulled over, because they were out of gas. She had not seen another car. And so here comes a car approaching and she's thinking, oh, it's got to be my husband. He must have found someone who, heard about our story and he's got gas and they're just giving him a ride up here to come drop him off. He's going to fill up the car. We're going to be out of here in a second. Thank goodness. And so Hannah, she doesn't get out of the car. She just sits there, waiting for this car to approach. And the car, as it gets closer and closer, it appears to slow down. And it's too dark to see, who's in the car, whether it's her husband or not. But this car is clearly slowing down. It appears to recognize her car and where she is. And she's expecting at any point this car is going to fully stop and her husband's going to get out. And so she's just waiting and the car is getting closer and it's slowing down. But then sort of inexplicably, right as this car is very close to her car, the car just peels out and speeds down the road, just away from her as fast as they could go, and then they're gone. And so immediately Hannah's like, okay, one, clearly not my husband, so that's disappointing. But two, like, what was that? Why did they do that? Why did they slow down and speed up like that? And the whole time this is going on, it's just constant thumping on the roof of her car, which by now she's almost zoned out, but it's persisting. And so at this point, Hannah went from being basically annoyed with the situation to now starting to feel a little bit freaked out. I mean, her husband's still not back. It's been, at this point, kind of a while since he left, and she doesn't really know how far the nearest gas station is going to be or how long it's going to take him, but she's starting to think, like, it should be soon. He should be getting back here. And this weirdness with the car speeding off like that wasn't normal. And then also there was just this constant thumping on the roof of her car. And she, again, had told herself it was a branch, but she's starting to wonder, like, is it? But like, what else could it be? And so now Hannah is sitting here staring out, into the darkness in front of her, like desperately wishing her husband would show up like any second here. Like, please, like, come out of the darkness and rescue me because this is getting really uncomfortable. Time kept on ticking on and her husband didn't show up and the thumping continued and no other cars came through. And so Hannah slowly began to worry that maybe her husband got lost. Like maybe he's not able to find where she is. Is she just like stranded out here? Like what's going on? And so as Hannah is sort of beginning to spiral, like as her thoughts are beginning to spiral and she's getting more and more worried, she started to give half a thought to leaving the car and forget about what's happening with the roof. Like, I'm going to go find my husband. Like, she thought about going and looking for him, but then she thought, like, oh, what's going to happen is I'm going to get out, I'm going to go look for him, and we're going to, like, pass each other in the dark. He's not going to know I'm looking for him, I'm not going to find him, and now he's going to be back at the car, and I'm missing. And so I'm just going to create more problems. And so she tells herself that really the only thing she can do that's responsible is just stay put. And so there she stays. And the thumping continues, and her husband continues not to show up. And like the time as it's going by, it's like agonizingly slow. And now she's getting really worked up that like, she's being watched or something. Like she's really starting to get paranoid. And all of a sudden, down the road, she sees something. And it's really a huge relief when she sees it at first. She sees more headlights. And at first she's thinking, oh, thank goodness, this has got to be my husband. Like this is a car coming up the road. He's going to be in there this time. He's going to get out of here. He's got the gas. We're going to get out of here. But as the headlights appeared over the horizon coming towards her, she realized it was not an ordinary car. It was not just headlights. There were also lights on top of this vehicle. It was a police car. And so this police car is cruising down the road and, Hannah's thinking, well, it could still be my husband. Maybe he got a ride from the police. But then she's thinking, oh my goodness, like has something happened to him? Are they coming to tell me that something's happened to my husband? Like she's having all these terrible thoughts. And so this police car, they come to a stop on the other side of the road. And at first, Hannah is just like unsure what she should even be doing. Like, should she get out to greet them? Should she wait here? But as she's just staring across the road at the two officers that are in this vehicle, and she doesn't see her husband in there, she sees the officer that's closest to her, the driver. He gets out of the car and he stands on the road and then he draws his pistol and he aims it at her. Like he's aiming the gun at her and the car she's in. And she's like, what is going on here? And so she just freezes, doesn't say or do anything. And the other officer in the passenger side, so on the far side of the car, he gets out of the cruiser as well, but he's got a megaphone in his hand. And so through this megaphone, he kind of leans out and he barks 3 orders to Hannah. The first order is get out of the car. The second order is come over to our car. And the third order is don't look back. And so at this point, Hannah realized that the first officer who stepped out of the car with the gun, he wasn't aiming at her. He was aiming at the roof of her car. That's where his gun was pointed right now. And so between that and the fact that she's been listening to this thumping sound for the last 45 minutes, assuming it was a branch, she's now realizing there's no way it's a branch. Like she sort of sensed it couldn't be, like it had to be something else, but she had sort of convinced herself, oh, it's a tree branch. Now she knows it's not. And so she had no idea what could possibly be on the roof of her car. But she knew whatever it was, it had to be bad. And so Hannah, all she wants to do is get out of this car and go over there. She doesn't want to be here anymore. I mean, this whole thing has been awful and now she's terrified, but she's frozen. What does she do? What's going on? But again, the officer with the bullhorn comes across and says, hey, get out of the car, come over to us and don't look back. Right now, get up, go. And so Hannah is like, I just gotta go. And so she opens her door, and as fast as she can, she gets out, she doesn't look back, she banks around the car, and across the street she goes, and the whole time she's thinking, oh, something's gonna grab me, but she gets to the cop car, she throws open the door, and she jumps inside, and at first, she adheres to their orders. She doesn't look back, as they told her to. She didn't look back. But now that she's safely inside the cop car, there's, 2 officers protecting her, one with a gun drawn, pointed at her car. She couldn't help herself. She had to see what was on the roof of her car. And so she went over to the window and she looked. And as soon as she saw what was on the roof of her car, she just starts screaming. And at the same time, the officer who is still standing out there with his gun drawn, he begins just firing nonstop at her car. And so Hannah, she screams, she ducks down behind the door. She can't see anything. There's just this constant barrage of gunfire, blasting the car and whatever was on the roof of the car. And then, Hannah, she's tucked down and she's thinking this is a nightmare. How is this real? She hears the sound of that officer who was shooting and the other officer. They get out of the car. She hears them run across the street towards her car. The shooting kind of stops and it's just the shuffling of feet. And then she hears this loud thumping sound as something really heavy slammed into the pavement. And then she heard the sound of something big running off into the jungle, into the tree line, trees just moving all around. And then there's just silence And then a moment later, she hears the sound of the officers coming back across the street. She's still tucked down. She can't look out the window. She just hears the sound of their footsteps. It's definitely them. And as they're getting closer, she can hear them like trying to make sense of what they just saw. Like they don't even know what they just saw. And at some point, Hannah's door opens up, and on the other side, it's the officer who had the megaphone, and he just looks ashen-faced. He's very shaken up. And he begins to try to explain what he's just seen, but it's clear he can't even describe it. And as he's trying to do it, like Hannah, she's crying, she's so upset, and she just tells him, like, don't even tell me. Like, I saw it too. When Hannah did look back, so when she went against the police's orders and she looked out the window back at her car, what she saw at first, like, didn't even compute. She saw that clearly there was no branch striking the roof of her car. What she saw was a woman. There was a woman on the roof of her car. This woman is like dirty and her hair is matted and it was like kind of covering like the front of her head. Like she's just like weirdly positioned on the roof of the car. Like that clearly was what was making the banging sound for the 45 minutes or so that she was over there. And so that alone is like horrific. But then in this instant that Hannah had looked over and seen this woman, the woman, she kind of appeared to be eating something. Like that was the gesticulation that she was doing. It sort of looked like she was eating something. And she looked up for a second as Hannah is staring across the road and her matted hair kind of parted. And the woman is looking right at Hannah and there's blood all over her mouth and her chin. And then Hannah saw what she was eating, and that's the thing that made her start screaming and prompted the police to start shooting. The woman was chewing on Hannah's husband's severed head. And so as soon as the police open fire, this cannibal woman lets go of the head and it falls to the pavement and it makes that loud thumping sound that Hannah would recall hearing as she's crouched down, wishing this was some nightmare. And then this woman, she leaps off the roof of the car, under a hail of gunfire. She lands on all fours, and like an animal, she gallops into the tree line and vanishes. And so the two officers, they ran across the street after her, but quickly realized, like, she was gone. And so they called for backup. Backup arrives, and all these officers go out into the jungle, and they can't find this woman. She's gone. But they would find the rest of the body. So the rest of the husband's body was actually not far from the vehicle. It was just laying out on the side of the road, sort of tucked up against the tree line. So tonight, I have a great story to tell you. It sort of reminds me of when I was a kid. I used to go camping with my family once a year out in Western Massachusetts, and we'd sit around a campfire just like this. And my parents would tell me and my sisters ghost stories. And it was sort of unclear how true the stories really were, but they were always terrifying. And this story that I'm going to share with you tonight is from Japan, and it happened about 50 years ago. And over the last 50 years, it's been shared many, many times, and there are many versions of the story. So it's sort of up to you to figure out how much you really believe is true here. But it is a genuinely frightening story. Also, according to some versions of the story, once you hear it, you only have 3 days left to live, unless you follow really specific instructions, which I'll give you at the end. But before we get into tonight's campfire story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and go to their movie cabinet where they keep all their VHS tapes and take all the covers off all the tapes and mix them all up. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. Late on a winter night in the 1970s, a middle-aged train driver named Takashi Ito, along with his assistant, were sitting in the front seat of a small cargo train that was hurtling along the tracks in Hokkaido, Japan. So this was just a 2-car train. There was a cargo train in back, and then there was the front train that, Takashi and his assistant were in. There were no passengers behind them, so it's just these two. And the area that they were driving through was this very desolate area. And basically outside, if they looked out their windshield, all they would have seen was just basically snow and ice and just pitch black darkness and the train's headlights pointing straight ahead. That would have been all they could see, was whatever, was in the headlights. And as they were driving along, they had shut all the windows to the car that they were in, but it was so cold outside and the wind was whipping and they're driving right into the wind that some of the cold air was coming in one of the windows. And, it's freezing cold out there. It was starting to get really cold inside the cabin. And so, both men are starting to shiver. And so at some point, Takashi turns to his assistant and he just tells him to, hey, go ahead and open up the heating vent on the floor. So there was just this little vent that you could open up that would basically expose the engine to the main cabin, and so some heat would come up from the engine. But it would get really hot really quickly, and so you couldn't do it for very long, but it was getting pretty cold. So this situation called for it. And so Takashi sort of had one eye half focused out the windshield, sort of roughly following along with the direction they were going. And then the rest of his attention was just on his assistant, who was doing this mundane task of crouching down and sliding open this vent here. And at some point, the assistant managed to open up the heating box. And right as he did, something caught Takashi's eye outside of the train. Now, remember, it's the middle of the night, it's the dead of winter, there's really nothing out there. And even though, of course, it's Takashi's job to pay attention to what's out in front of them, there's no expectation he's going to see anything on the tracks at all until he gets to the next stop, which was quite a ways away. And so the fact that anything caught his attention was alarming, and he turns and he looks out the windshield and he can't believe what he sees right in the middle of the tracks. Just several dozen yards ahead of the speeding train is a woman. She's just standing in the middle of the tracks looking up at the train and doesn't even appear to be trying to move, but she clearly sees the train barreling down on her. She looks terrified, and Takashi and the assistant, they look at each other, they start trying to get the train to stop, but there's no way. The train's going way too fast, it's way too heavy, and so it's like they throw the brakes on, they're trying to stop, but there's nothing they can do, and this woman, she's just not moving. And then eventually the train smashes into her, and like Takashi and the assistant are like, oh my God, I can't believe it. And the train, it eventually comes to a grinding stop, several hundred yards away. And then finally, when it's actually stopped, it's like Takashi and the assistant, they know what's happened. They've just killed someone. I mean, it's clearly an accident, but like the shock of this was unbelievable. And so finally, Takashi, he looks at the assistant and he's like, we have to go out and see if she's okay. I mean, they both knew there was no chance. Like, there's no chance she's alive after being hit by the train. But out they go, and sort of apprehensively, they began walking in the snow towards the back of the train. Now, neither of them had a lighting source. They didn't have a flashlight or anything like that. And they're going towards the back of the train. So they don't have the advantage of the headlights shining where they need to go. All they have are the taillights of the train, which are now flashing red. And so as they're walking through the snow and the wind is whipping and it's pitch black out there, and of course these two men, they're in shock about what they've just seen. They can't believe, like, what was she doing out here? Like, what happened? They're walking and all they're seeing out in front of them is darkness and the occasional, flash of red light that sort of roughly illuminated the snow out beyond the train, and then back to darkness. And they know somewhere out there behind the train is this woman who almost certainly is dead. So it means that there's like a dead body out there. And so Takashi and the assistant, they start making their way back towards the back of the cargo train, and then they begin walking beyond where the train was, basically along the tracks they had just covered. And sure enough, up ahead, periodically illuminated by these red lights, was this, mound on the tracks. It looked very much like a body. And sure enough, as Takashi got closer, he realized it was the woman. And almost immediately, he could tell, one, she was definitely dead. And in some ways, he kind of hoped maybe, there was some miracle that she'd survived somehow, maybe, but definitely confirmed that she's dead. And the second thing was he could sort of see what happened here. Her foot appeared to be wedged in the tracks. She must have been stuck in the tracks. And even though it looked like she wasn't trying to move, it might have been because she literally couldn't. And so she was trapped, and we hit her and we killed her. But that wasn't all. I mean, this scene was horrible. I mean, her body was destroyed. But more than that, part of her body was missing. All they saw on the tracks were actually just her legs. it was just her lower half, and she had these lace-up dance shoes that would have been very difficult to take off. The dance shoes sort of gave away that this was the woman. They look like feminine legs, feminine feet, but again, her upper half is just gone. And so Takashi and the assistant, they sort of look around in the general vicinity to see if, her upper half is nearby. And again, all they have is this periodic red flashing light across the snow, and it's dark, it's cold, the wind is whipping. And sure enough, just a little ways off the tracks, they see another sort of heap on the ground, and there's nothing else out here. So this has got to be the woman's upper body. And so they cross over the tracks, they leave behind the lower half, and they see there's like a trail of blood across the snow. And when they get to this second mound, it is this woman's upper body. But I mean, the scene, it would have been horrible for anyone to find this, but it was especially so because as they walked up to this woman's clearly, dead upper half, she was looking right at them. I mean, her arms were outstretched and her eyes were open, and her torso, it's positioned in such a way that she was almost like staring at them. And they walk up to her, and her face, Takashi would say that it was almost like she was looking at him with an accusatory look, like she was mad at him for not having stopped the train. Couldn't you see I was trapped on the train? Like, that's what Takashi's thinking. Like, this dead woman is mad at me. She looks like she's furious with me. And so, it was very hard, but they continued walking towards her to, just really confirm that she's definitely dead. This is not like a second person here, but no, it was clearly just the upper half of this woman, and she was definitely dead. And despite the very unsettling nature of the way her body was positioned, ultimately, Takashi and the assistant, just turned around and began walking back towards the train. Now, this is 1970s Japan. They don't have cell phones. In fact, they didn't even have radios. Like, they didn't have a good way to get in touch with anyone. They clearly knew they needed to tell authorities what happened here, but realistically, the only way to do that was to go to the train, and then one of them would have to basically walk to the nearest civilization and get help that way, while the other person stayed with the train and also with the woman. And so the two of them, they get back to the train, they get inside of that front car, inside of the enclosed warm space, and they shut the doors, and they sort of just look at each other like, okay, this is obviously horrible, but what are we gonna do? And Takashi, being the more senior of the two, said, well, look, I'll stay here with the train. You, the assistant, go out and get help. I'll be here when you come back. And so the assistant, as much as it was sort of daunting to have to walk off into the darkness and the freezing cold, it almost was like a relief to get away from this scene. I mean, this was truly horrific. And so, Takashi watched as the assistant bundled up in his jacket, and he headed out the side of the car door, and then off into the darkness he went. And then Takashi was left alone inside of the train with, this woman's body behind them on the tracks. And so shortly after the assistant had gone, Takashi, he's just sitting inside of this unmoving train car. And remember, they had that heating vent open, and even though the train was not moving, there was still quite a bit of heat that was coming up into the cabin. And so it was actually getting quite toasty inside of this train car. And Takashi is literally just not moving. He's just sitting there waiting, just trying not to let his mind wander to this horrible thing that's happened behind him. And he found himself actually feeling kind of tired. I mean, he had had a really long day. I mean, he'd been up for nearly 24 hours at this point. And so suddenly he was like, man, maybe I ought to just lay down and close my eyes for a minute, because obviously when they come back here, they'll wake me up, like no problem. And so Takashi did eventually get down on the ground right next to that vent, so he was really getting the maximum amount of heat. And he curled up and he closed his eyes. But pretty much immediately, once Takashi closed his eyes and effectively attempted to sleep, all he could see in his mind was that woman standing on the tracks looking up at him before she was struck by the train. And then he would try to, force himself not to think about that, telling himself it really was an accident. He could not have stopped the train. And also, they rounded a corner before they saw her. It wasn't like they could have seen her if they hadn't been fiddling around with the heating vent beforehand. They wouldn't have seen her. They had to turn that corner, and then they saw her. Like, there was no way to avoid this. This was an accident. But it's like he couldn't get that image of the woman out of his mind. And then if he managed not to think about her on the tracks, his mind would then jump to seeing her upper half positioned on the snow with her eyes still open, looking at him with this, in his mind, this sort of accusatory look on her face. And so he can't sleep, but like he's so exhausted from the day and he's just so worn out, it's so traumatic that eventually after, 10 minutes or so, he did begin to feel himself sort of allowing himself to drift off to sleep. Like he did have these horrible thoughts, but he felt himself getting closer to finally being able to get a little bit of sleep. And right at that point, right as he's teetering on actually sleeping, he hears something outside. Now, remember, it's late at night, the wind is whipping, it's the middle of winter, and so there had been this ongoing ambiance of the howling wind and like nighttime winter sounds outside. There are animals out there. I mean, there's lots of noises going on here. But whatever the sound was, he just couldn't quite place it. It almost sounded like metallic, like something was scraping against something else, like maybe two pieces of metal were grinding together, like shk, shk. But he couldn't quite tell what it was, how far away it was, but it really stood out right away amongst all the other noises he was hearing. And so he's laying there on the ground and he's listening to the sound. He can't quite place how close or far away it is. For all he knows, it could be way off in the distance or it could be right in the cargo train behind him. And so as he hears this sound, which is sort of periodic, he tells himself like, oh, maybe it's my assistant. Maybe he's back with help. Maybe he found someone really quickly, because it's only been like 10 minutes since he left. But then he's thinking like, there's no way. Like, I know we're sort of in the middle of nowhere. We're in this really desolate part of Japan. Like, there's no way he would have just magically found help that quickly. So it can't be my assistant, unless maybe he's turned around for some reason, but why would he do that? And so he's sort of picturing like, what were the reasons that it could be the assistant? And as he's doing that, the sound is getting louder and it's definitely getting closer. And the sound is, again, it's like a shk, shk, shk. It's like a grinding sort of like movement almost, like something's coming towards him. And he can tell now that the sound, whatever it is definitely near like the cargo train. Like it's right behind where he is. And the way he's laying, his head is towards the front of the train, so his feet are close to the door that led out into the open and then would eventually lead you to the cargo train behind. And so he's starting to get sort of apprehensive. Like, what is that? Is it like an animal? Like, could it be the wind? Is it like somehow whipping against the train in some way that it's making this strange sound? And all the while, this grinding sort of like rhythmic sound is getting louder and louder and sort of faster and faster. And then finally, as the sound is so loud that it's practically echoing inside of this room he's in, he hears the door to where he is slide open. And he turns and he looks to see what is coming into the train. And when he sees what it is, he starts to scream. About an hour later, Takashi's assistant, who had managed to go get help, was in the back seat of a police cruiser along with two police officers who were driving in the direction of this train. There was actually a road that kind of cut out into this sort of desolate area that overlooked the train tracks. And sure enough, they pulled into this sort of carve out on the road, and the assistant pointed, and there it was. There was the train sort of off in the distance, sort of walking distance from where the car was. And so the cops, they parked, and all three of them, they get out, and the police officers, they had flashlights. And so it was much easier to navigate the sort of barren terrain here. And they walked away from the car down to the train. Now, remember, obviously there has been a tragedy here. This woman was struck by the train. And of course, the police know this by this point, and the assistant knows that's what they're walking up to, the scene of this woman being killed. But there really wasn't anything, sort of darker than that. Like, this was a terrible accident. But it's sort of like, we just got to follow protocol now. We got to go down there, we got to figure out what happened and sort of, follow process, if you will. And so the three of them, they know what they're walking into, right? They're going to meet Takashi, he's waiting in the train, and they're going to take it from there. And so they're walking through the darkness, and they're shining their lights, and the assistant is behind the two police officers, and they're walking up to the train. And when they get close enough to the train, the assistant begins yelling out for Takashi to let him know, like, hey, we're here, we're here, like, come on out. But Takashi doesn't call back. He doesn't come out of the train. But again, this is not like hugely alarming. the assistant's like, okay, maybe he fell asleep inside of the train car. And so the two police officers and the assistant, they make their way over to the door that leads into the front car of the train, and they slide it open and they step inside. It's a very small space, and Tekashi's not in there. And there's no sign of anything bad that's happened. He's just not in here. And so the assistant's like, okay, that's weird. It's sort of odd that he didn't respond to us calling for him. He's not in here, but maybe he's in the cargo train, the second car for some reason. And so they leave the front train car and they go into the cargo train car, and Tekashi's not in there either. And so at this point, the cops are looking at the assistant like, what's going on here? Like, where would Tekashi be? It's the middle of the night. Like, it's just pure barren wasteland. It's ice and snow everywhere. Why would he leave? And so the assistant's like, maybe he left and he's with the body. Maybe he was just standing with the body or something. And so the two police officers and the assistant, they begin walking towards the back of the train and then begin following the tracks towards where, the lower half of this woman is, according to the assistant. And so down the tracks they go, and sure enough, eventually they see up ahead the legs that are sort of still stuck in the tracks. And as they're shining the light and they're calling out for Tekashi, there's no answer, and Tekashi is nowhere to be found. And so now the assistant's really getting worried. Like, it didn't make any sense. Where could he have gone? The only other place that made any sense was maybe over near the torso. But the assistant knows, like, of all places that at least he would want to be, it would not be near the upper half. I mean, that was so creepy. The way the body was positioned, the way it was staring at them. And he knew Tekashi had been really unsettled by it. So why would he go over to that? But he told the cops, like, hey, shine the light sort of over there off the tracks, because the upper half of this woman, that's where she is. Maybe he's over there. And so they shine their lights in the direction of where the upper half was. And there's no Tekashi, and there's no upper half. There is no torso. The woman's torso is gone. And where it was, very clearly, is this huge sort of like flattened section of snow with blood everywhere. And it's like this just horrible scene, but there's no upper body. So Tekashi's gone, and this woman's body, her upper half anyways, is gone. And so now, like, the assistant and the officers, they really don't know what to make of this. But the first thought, at least from the assistant, was maybe a bear came through and was, basically taking the woman's body to go eat it or something. And maybe Tekashi was out here, and maybe he got chased off by the bear, or worse, maybe he got attacked by the bear. And this sort of made sense. Like, oh my God, like, is there a bear nearby? Like, do we need to go in the train just to seek safety here? And so the police officers, they're sort of scanning their lights around, trying to see if maybe Tekashi's nearby. And at some point they notice there's actually boot prints that leave where the torso had been. And they sort of took off into the night, sort of away from the train, sort of off into the distance. Now, there didn't appear to be any bear tracks around, but again, they're thinking that's what it could be, but they see these boot prints and they're like, we gotta go check. We gotta see if maybe these prints will lead us to Tekashi. And so Tekashi and the two officers, they begin following these tracks, and as they do, they see the prints, these boot prints, get farther and farther apart, like Tekashi was running, like his stride was getting longer and longer, and there's blood everywhere, like this drag mark of blood all over the snow. And they follow these prints all the way past the train, way off into the night, where they finally stop in front of this huge utility pole. And at this point, they're looking around like where's Tekashi? Like, where did he go? Like, there's nothing down here. And then at some point, they hear something above them. And so the police officers, with their flashlights, they shine up towards the top of this utility pole, where at the top, there was this fairly large metal platform. And as they shine their lights up, they see Tekashi. And he's draped over the edge of this platform, totally lifeless. His arms are dangling down, and he's got this horrible, huge wound across his stomach. He's bled all over. He's clearly deceased. And so they're shining their lights up at him, and like the shock of seeing Tekashi is horrible. They back up. They're like, oh my God, is there a bear here? Did the bear somehow get up there with Tekashi? Like, what's making that noise up there? And they're shining their lights, and at some point they hear a noise again. And then as their lights are aimed towards Tekashi in this platform, this figure sort of emerges above Tekashi, like it crawled over Tekashi, and it peered down at the two cops and the assistant. and it was the woman's torso. It's like her upper half. She sort of looked down at them, blood's all over her, and she's sort of clutching on to Takashi. And then in one move, she sort of thrust herself over his body and began pulling herself down the pole towards the men. And the men, they immediately start yelling and they turn and they start running. And as they're running off, all they can hear behind them is chick, 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 which is the sound of this woman dragging herself through the snow towards them. Now, unfortunately, the assistant did not make it. The woman caught up to him. But the two police officers, they were able to run back to their car. They got in and they sped off towards the station, and they told people what was going on at this train. I mean, they couldn't even describe it really without it sounding totally made up. And so eventually, reinforcements head back to the train. And when they get there, they find the assistant. He clearly had been caught by this woman on his way to the car, and he was destroyed. His stomach was ripped wide open. He was dead. But, the authorities, they searched everywhere and they couldn't find this woman. Her upper half was just gone. Her legs were still stuck in the tracks, but the murderous upper half of her was gone, and they never found her. Today, it's said that the animated top half of this woman's corpse still haunts the railroad tracks in Hokkaido. She's known as Teke Teke because that is the name that was given to sort of encapsulate the sound that she would make as she pulled herself through the snow. The sort of chik, chik sound became Teke Teke. Now, according to some versions of this story, after you've heard the legend of Teke Teke, like you have now, you only have 3 days before she shows up to get you. But it is possible to survive it. Before she slices you in half across your midsection, she'll pause to ask you one question. And if you answer this question correctly, she'll let you live. The question is, do you need your legs? And the only correct answer, spoken exactly like this, is yes, I need them right now. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Hey guys, welcome back to the official MrBallen Campfire. Tonight I have two awesome stories to tell you. They are both of the strange variety. In both stories, we're going to talk about a tragedy, but it is not the tragedy that is the reason we remember these things. We remember these events, or we still talk about these events, because in both stories, there are elements that just nobody can fully explain. There are truly unexplained phenomena that are fascinating, that are terrifying, and I know you're going to love it. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and replace all of their shoelaces with 20-foot long shoelaces. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. Just before 10 a.m. on November 14th, 1995, a 19-year-old man named Zhang ran down a dark street toward a bus stop on the outskirts of Beijing, which is the capital city of China. Zhang, who worked at a fast food restaurant, had gotten off work late. And so now he had to catch this bus because it was the last one out of the area, and if he missed it, he'd be stranded. So this area where Zhang worked was actually a pretty historic district in Beijing. It was home to several old palaces and shrines that were built at the foot of this mountain called Baiwang Mountain. And so this area was sort of like a popular tourist area. And so during the day, it was very busy. There was lots of cabs coming in and out of the area. But at night, it was basically deserted and no cabs came through here. So again, the bus really was his only shot of getting out here unless he wanted to walk on foot, and that was just not practical. And so Zhang continued running along until he turned the corner, and up ahead he saw the bus stop, and he didn't see the bus. It was just basically a deserted street, but standing near the bus stop was this old woman, and it appeared like she was waiting for the bus, which suggested to Zhang that he had not missed the final bus, because clearly she was waiting for it too, unless she also missed it perhaps, but it just seemed like she hadn't. And so Zhang, who by this point is like kind of out of breath, he stopped running and he walked the last distance up to the bus stop where this woman was. And as he approached her, she kind of turned and looked at him like, "Who are you? You know, it's late at night. She's all alone. You know, it's just kind of weird." But she looked at him and he kind of just smiled at her to signal like, "I'm no threat. You know, I'm just here for the bus too." And then before the two could even talk, Zhang heard the sound of a bus approaching. And he turned, and here comes bus 375. It came to a stop. The old woman climbed on, and Zhang followed up right after her. A moment later, Zhang was inside the bus. The doors had closed behind him. The driver had taken off from the curb. Zhang had paid the ticket seller, who was separate from the driver, sitting in sort of the front right seat. And the woman who had been in front of him, she also had paid. She had sat down in the row right next to the ticket seller, right behind the driver. And Zhang, even though the whole bus was empty, nobody else is on here except for these three people, he just sat down right behind the old woman. So he takes his seat, you know, they're driving down the road, and, you know, it's late at night, he's tired, he's had a long shift. And so for a little while, Zhang just looked out the window and watched all the, you know, imperial gardens and the shrines and all the various landmarks that drew people to the area. You know, this was, again, sort of a touristy area. He's just watching it all pass by. You know, it's late, it's dark, he can't see much out there. But eventually, you know, relatively soon after they had started, they passed by sort of all the touristy stuff, and they entered into this stretch of road that Zhang was very familiar with. He took bus 375 home all the time. That, you know, this stretch was very desolate. There was no more buildings, no more anything. It was just kind of forest and wild on either side of the road. And so as a result, at night, driving this desolate stretch was very, very dark. There was just literally no lights. And so once they were in this sort of desolate stretch, Zhang found himself just kind of leaning back and closing his eyes, because it was a little bit of a ride before he'd get to his stop and get off the bus. And so he just closed his eyes and he's trying to kind of nod off, and they're driving for a little while, and he kind of felt himself beginning to fall asleep when suddenly he felt the bus start to slow down. Now, there was no indication within the bus that anything had happened. Zhang knew that it was way too early to be at the next bus stop, and so immediately he opened his eyes and he's just kind of looking around for some cue from the driver or the ticket seller or even this woman, like what was going on here. But then the bus came to a full stop, and it's so dark outside that Zhang like literally can't see what's going on out there, and no one's saying anything, and the driver just kind of inexplicably gets up from his seat and he walks out of the bus, like he exits the bus, which was odd. Like there's no clear reason for this. And so Zhang, the woman, even the ticket seller, they're kind of just like peering out the window, out the front window of the bus to see what's going on. But given how dark it was outside and the fact that there was really only light inside the bus, it had the effect of just kind of making all the interior glass of the bus be sort of reflective, like really difficult to look out. Imagine sitting inside of a dark room with a light and being surrounded by glass. It'd be impossible to look out at. All you would see was like a mirror effect all around you. And so for a minute, Zhang and the others are just kind of like wondering what's happening. What did the driver see? And then Zhang heard something outside the bus that sounded like people talking, or maybe he thought it was people talking. And so he pressed his face up to the glass and put his hands up to it to see if he could cut through that sort of mirror effect to see what was going on out there. And at first it was just darkness. He couldn't see anything. But eventually his eyes adjusted, and on his side of the bus, on the road, the driver clearly was interacting with what looked like multiple people, like 2, maybe even 3 people that are down there. There didn't appear to be, any other vehicle. Like It just wasn't clear what was happening, but there was definitely people outside of the bus. And so Zhang and the others, no one's talking. They're all just kind of trying to make sense of what's happening. And then before anybody could ask any questions, the driver comes back on the bus, sits down in the driver's seat, and then behind him come these 3 new people, who presumably were the same people the driver was speaking to outside the bus. They also are likely the reason the driver stopped in the first place, although again, it's very unclear why they stopped in the first place. Like, there's no reason to be stopping here, but Zhang at this point just wants to get home. He doesn't really care. But these 3 people, they come on board the bus, and immediately Zhang and the woman and the ticket seller, they're all looking at them like, what's going on here? So there were 3 men, and they were all wearing these traditional silk robes. There were 2 in blue, and there was 1 in red. And the 2 men in blue were like physically holding up the 3rd man in red, almost like he couldn't stand on his own. Like, picture somebody who was like really intoxicated, like he couldn't quite stand. But immediately Zhang clocked that this guy didn't look drunk or something. He looked hurt. Like, he was covered in mud and like grime, as if he had been like rolling around on the ground or something, or maybe he had fallen or whatever. Like, it wasn't clear, but something happened to this guy. And the 2 guys in blue, who their robes are pristine, they're holding this guy up, and they kind of bring him into the bus, and then without saying anything to these people on the bus, they just kind of dragged this man, who was conscious, but again, barely able to stand, down the aisle, past Zhang, past the others, to the back of the bus, where they took their seat. And then it was like, nobody said anything. The driver didn't acknowledge how bizarre this whole thing was. He just pulled away and started driving. And then before long, it's like Zhang is just sitting there, really unclear, like, what's even happening. But as they're driving along, he just felt so uncomfortable. The woman right in front of him, she had gone, back to looking straight ahead. She's not paying attention to what's happening behind her. Same with the ticket seller. But Zhang, he just felt really uncomfortable. And specifically what he felt was, it just seemed like the 3 guys in the back, the silk robe guys, 1, they were completely silent, eerily silent. And 2, it just felt like Zhang, it was almost like he could feel them staring at him. Not just looking straight ahead towards the front of the bus, but it was like they were looking at him. It was like a primal sense that Zhang had. And the more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable he became, and frankly, the more fearful he became. Like, it was like every little noise behind him was like confirmation that they were like looking at him, or maybe moving up the aisle to get closer to him. But he couldn't bring himself to turn around and look. It was like he was terrified of what he was going to see behind him. And so he just stayed glued to his seat, rigidly looking straight ahead. But again, it was like this whole ride, he's just like, they're staring at me, something is off, like, what's going on with these guys? And it went on and on for like 10, 15 minutes of just this really tense ride. But despite how sort of awful this ride had become, even though he couldn't fully articulate exactly why it was just so uncomfortable, despite all that, Zhang is thinking, any minute now, we're going to get to my stop, I'm going to get off the stupid bus, and this is going to be over and done with, and I'll forget all about this stuff. But before they reached his stop, while they're still in this sort of isolated part of the ride where it's very dark outside, Zhang, who again is just sort of glued, looking straight ahead, he notices the woman right in front of him, who this whole time has seemingly completely forgot about the guys behind her. Like, she's just looking straight ahead, no big deal. She just all of a sudden turns around and looks towards the back of the bus. Just one fluid motion. She just turned and looked. And Zhang, he's staring at the woman as she does this. And he watches as her face goes from, curious and just sort of normal to her eyes going wide. And she stands up and she just starts screaming and pointing towards the back of the bus. And then before Zhang can turn around himself, and he's still too scared to even look, he feels something smack into the side of his head, and so he's like disoriented. It hits him again and again, and he realizes it's the woman who's screaming at whatever's happening in the back of the bus, and she's hitting him over and over again with her purse, and she's yelling something, and Zhang's like, what is going on? He's realizing she's screaming, thief, at Zhang. She's hitting him in the head, screaming thief. He's got no clue why. He doesn't know why she's yelling at whatever's happening in the back. And before long, the bus driver just stops the bus, and without even asking what's going on, he just looks at Zhang and just gestures, get off the bus. As if Zhang is like the central issue on this bus. Not the strange people we've picked up 20 minutes ago that no one has any explanation for. No explanation for why this woman is screaming about whatever they're doing back there. The bus driver has just decided that Zhang is the issue. And Zhang, at this point, does just want to get off the bus. He doesn't want to be here. And so without even looking at the back, he just got up, no questions asked, breezed past the woman who's still hitting him with her bag, and out the door he goes. He didn't care. He knew he had a long walk home, but anything was better than being in that bus. Now, once Zhang actually got off the bus, he realized he actually was not in as bad of a spot as he could have been. Like, he expected to get off and basically be in the middle of nowhere because he knew they were in this sort of isolated area. But when he got off, he realized they had sort of just came to the end of that isolated section. And so pretty nearby, he could see a neighborhood, which meant he actually was not that far away from his home. And so he's thinking, okay, I got a bit of a walk, but again, thank goodness I'm not on that bus. I don't even want to think about what's happening on that crazy bus. Like, thank goodness I'm just out of there. And so Zhang, he just starts walking towards his home and he's making his way when he hears something behind him. And he immediately stops because think about how traumatic whatever just happened was for him. He can't process what's happened. It's this totally crazy, inexplicable thing. He's on the side of the road now, like he's on edge. And so he hears something behind him and he just stops. And this time, unlike on the bus, he does turn around to see what's going on. And he turns and he sees he's not alone. Standing behind him on the sidewalk is the old woman. And she's staring right at him. And so Zhang, he's looking at her and immediately he clocks that like something's different about her. On the bus, that expression she had on her face when she screamed at whatever was in the back of the bus and then began hitting him with her purse, that expression she had was like fear and paranoia and even anger. That's what he saw on her face. But now she's like smiling and she's looking at him with this almost like I'm sorry look on her face. Like please, I want to talk to you about what just happened. Like she was signaling to him like we need to talk. And so picking up on that, Zhang, like he wanted to just go over to her and be like, what are you doing? Like, why did you do that to me? I didn't take anything from you. Like he wanted to yell at her. But again, there was just that look on her face that said, like, I got to go talk to this woman. And so Zhang, he turns and he walks to this woman and he says to her, like, what happened on there? Like, what's going on? Like, what did you see? What happened? And she looked at him and she was like, I have to tell you a secret. So that night, unbeknownst to Zhang and very likely unbeknownst to this woman, this bus they were on, bus 375, after they got off, it would take off and drive off with its strange occupants on board. And believe it or not, the bus would vanish. It would just go missing. Nobody knew where it went. And then 3 days later, it was found crashed in a reservoir 60 miles north of where Zhang and this woman had gotten off. And on board the bus were 3 dead bodies. It was the driver, the ticket seller, and then also the man wearing red, the guy who was needing to be propped up by the other 2 men in blue. Now, authorities made no mention of the men in blue. It was just these 3 people were found on board the bus. Now, it was determined that all 3 of them had died from a broken neck. And so the running assumption was the crash itself caused them to break their necks, and that's what killed them. But there was a very strange determination about the condition of the bodies. So the occupants on board the bus presumably died within 72 hours because that's the time frame they were missing and when they were found dead. But it was determined that their bodies were so decomposed they likely had been dead for months. The secret that the old woman told Zhang was that when she turned around on the bus and she looked to the back and she saw the men, she said the men in blue were staring at Zhang with just a look of pure evil on their face. She was like, I knew it wasn't right. These were evil spirits and they were after Zhang. It was like she instinctively just knew it. She didn't know why, she just knew it. And almost like reflexively, she began screaming. And then it was like this thought crossed her mind that she needed to save Zhang. And the first thing she thought to do was accuse him of being a thief so the bus driver would stop and kick him off the bus. And so she put on this performance, hitting him, calling him a thief, basically to save him, to get him off the bus away from what she thought were literally evil spirits. And so think about this. She's telling Zhang this on the side of the road. They're in the middle of nowhere. Their ride is pulling away. Zhang wasn't like, oh boy, thank you so much for saving me from the evil spirits on the bus. He's like, okay, I get it now. I guess I appreciate it. And then the two of them just took off on their merry way. It wasn't until 3 days later that Zhang realized whatever caused her to have that reaction literally saved his life. And who knows who the men in blue were? Because something happened on that bus, something caused it to vanish and then crash into the reservoir, and everybody dies on board with their necks broken and their bodies decomposed more than they should be. Like, none of that makes any sense. But all Zhang knows is because of that woman, he was still alive. And so Zhang is like a mix between terrified that he was involved in this, but also so thankful that this woman saved his life. But what he did when he put it all together, when he found out about this bus and, what happened on board, the dead bodies and all that, he went to the authorities and he said there were two other people on the bus that were acting so weird, the men in blue, the ones the woman basically warned him about being these evil spirits. And he told the authorities. And, whether or not they bought the evil spirit line didn't really matter. What they're being told is there were two people acting strange on the bus before this all happened. And they went out and they looked for the two men in blue. And they never found them. No one has any idea who they were. And so to this day, all the locals all say to never take the last bus ride along Route 375. On a fall afternoon in 1887, a man named Gene Wilson rode his horse next to the Platte River in Wyoming, herding some cattle that were grazing there. Next to him was Gene's dog, who was running along dutifully right behind him and sort of nipping at the cows' heels to keep them in line. So Gene was a ranch hand, and he worked for a ranch in the town of Casper, which was about maybe 10 miles away from where he was right now. And part of Gene's responsibilities was going out and finding lost cattle that wandered too far from the ranch and herding them back to the pasture. So on this particular day, the weather was perfect, it's sunny, it's beautiful, and generally Gene actually really enjoyed this aspect of his job. Like, he liked being out here. But today, even though he should have been like, this is a great day, he just felt really, really tired. He had worked many, many hours up until this point, and he really just wanted to be done and head back home to where he lived with his wife. They had this little house that was sort of tucked away in this secluded area in this valley surrounded by hills. It was like his oasis. Gene and his wife were like absolute best friends, like the very best part of his day, even on days where he went out and enjoyed his job. Still, the best part of his day was always returning home and just catching up with his wife over dinner. That was like the thing he looked forward to the most. And so right now it was like he craved just being home and being with his wife. He could not wait. But Gene, he was a diligent guy, and he just continued doing his job. He's trotting along the river, he's herding the cows. And at some point, as he's sort of at this point mindlessly doing his job, because again, he doesn't want to be here anymore, he looks down and he notices his dog is no longer next to him. His dog was always right next to him, helping, doing the herding, and his dog's not there. And so he stopped and he began looking around, and that's when he realized that maybe because he was becoming so mindless doing this job today, that this huge amount of mist had sort of rolled out over the Platte River. Like, he hadn't noticed that there was just all this mist. And as he's looking out, seeing this massive cloud of mist, he noticed his dog. And his dog was actually kind of going nuts. The dog had broken off and run to the edge of the Platte River, and it was sort of like barking like mad. And it had been for some time. It was like Gene just hadn't noticed it. And so he's seeing the mist and he's seeing his dog, and he's like, what's going on over here? He can't see anything on the river. This is a usually pretty well-traveled river, but there hadn't been any traffic, no boats or anything. And so it's a quiet day, but it's like he can't see anything out on the river. The dog is just going crazy. And so Gene's like, what's going on? What's out over there? And this is also like very unusual behavior for his dog. Like, his dog was very well trained. This is an odd thing for it to be doing. But, Gene's thinking there's got to be a good reason for it. The dog wouldn't do this for no reason. And so Gene, he lets the cattle just continue making their way along the river, but he, on his horse, he turns and begins making his way over to the dog, who again is sort of stationary by the river's edge, barking and looking out at something in the middle of this mist, presumably. However, as Gene trotted his way towards the dog, the horse began to react to something. Gene's horse began to react to something that Gene couldn't even see. It started to get really scared. It was whinnying and sort of unwilling to go any further. And then finally, when Gene really tried to get the horse to carry on here, the horse actually reared onto its back legs and almost kicked Gene off of it. Gene managed to hold on, and when the horse came back down on all fours, he just calmed the horse down and brought it over to a nearby tree. The whole time, the dog is still barking like crazy, looking at something out over the water. And so now Gene's like, what is going on here? He gets off his horse and he ties it to a tree, and then on foot, he walks over to his dog. And so he walks over to his dog's, yapping and barking, and as soon as Gene is next to his dog stops barking, but it continues to be really fixated on the water, which again is utterly covered by mist. He can't see anything out on the water. It's quiet, eerily quiet. The mist is almost obscuring the sunlight at this point. It's almost like they're inside of a cloud, and it's just him and his dog. The dog is fixated on something, and Gene's looking out over the water. And then all of a sudden, it was like the mist began to part, and this enormous, way bigger than he had ever seen on the Platte River, this huge wooden ship suddenly comes into view. And so right away, Gene is sort of baffled by the ship. Number one, it seemed fairly obvious that this is the thing that his dog was barking at. And it might have been the same thing that the horse was reacting to, but Gene's like, why? There are ships that go up and down this river all the time. The dog, the horse, they don't react this way to any of those ships. What's that about? But more than that, this ship really was just enormous. Looked out of place. It was so big. And this is not a particularly deep river. And so Gene's like, how is this big of a ship here? And so Gene's almost fascinated with what he's looking at. He's sort of not really worried about the dog anymore, or the horse, or even his cattle. He's looking at the ship, wondering what in the heck it's doing here. Whose ship is this? And so Gene continues to watch as the ship, continues just slowly making its way down Platte River. And as he's staring at it, again, just sort of fascinated by it, he counts 9 sailors on the deck, moving around, doing something on the deck. But what they were doing on the deck just wasn't immediately clear. They weren't doing sort of obvious sailor things. They were clearly working on something in unison on the deck. There was something they were doing all together. There was this apparent huge tarp almost that sat in the middle of the deck of the ship, and they were sort of moving it around, and it appeared like there was something underneath it, but Gene couldn't see it, and he was too far away to make out what it could be. And so Gene is he's staring at this crew, he's looking at the ship, and then all of a sudden, all 9 of the sailors on board the ship, almost like in unison, just stopped what they were doing, and they turned, and they all at the exact same time just stared directly at Gene. And it sort of disarmed Gene. He was really, staring intently at them. It was alarming to have them all be looking at him all at once. And so he's sort of taken aback, and he's looking out at them are they looking at me? What did I do? What's going on here? And then all at once, these 9 people, they go back to what they're doing, and they begin to lift up this tarp, right? So they're revealing what's underneath it. And now, Gene, he's both terrified and sort of confused and still just fascinated. And he's looking out what are they going to reveal? This is so weird. And the tarp comes up. And at first, all Gene could see was this weird mound, a black mound sitting on the deck of the ship that was underneath this tarp. But as he continued to stare, he suddenly realized what he was looking at, it couldn't be possible. How could that be out? That doesn't make any sense to me. And he was horrified. He was scared, and he's thinking I don't even know what to do. And all of a sudden he grabs his dog, he runs back to his horse, and he thinks, I have to get home. I have to get home right now. And so on his horse he goes, he just gets his dog, he abandons the cattle. From what he's seen, he doesn't even care. He has to make sure that everything back home is okay. And he takes off. He starts galloping as fast as he can back in the direction of that quaint little home he's got down in the hillside. And so over an hour of riding, basically at full tilt, he finally crests the hill, and by this point, he's tried to convince himself that what he saw on board that ship could not have been a real thing. But he goes up the hill that looks down into the valley, where he would normally first see his home. Except when he looked down into the valley, his home wasn't there anymore. His home was just this smoldering black ruin. The home had burned down, apparently in the last few hours while he was gone. And so Gene is a mixture of horrified, but also weirdly not surprised, and he blazes down the hill. He gets to what remains of his home, and he sees that's not all. He sees there is a black mound that looked just like the mound he saw on board that ship that is laying on the ground not far from where his house was. And it's the body of his wife. That's what he saw out on the ship. He saw the dead body of his wife burned and destroyed, but it was definitely her. He could make her out from here. It scared him so bad he went back to check, and now he's seeing it in real life. Now, of course, for all you folks who are hearing this story, you're going to think, come on, like this happened in the 1800s. Like how much of this is really true? What, he looked out and he saw a ghost ship appear with a premonition or a vision of his wife who he's going to find dead? Sure, right? Well, listen to this. So after Gene finds his dead wife, he has this incredible story about how he sort of knew about it beforehand by seeing this ghost ship, if you will. And so he went and told people. He told a lot of people about what happened. And eventually, a few years later, his story found its way to a journalist named Vincent Gaddis. And Vincent Gaddis happened to have done all this extensive reporting about the infamous Bermuda Triangle, which is just off the coast of Bermuda. There's this section of the ocean where all this very strange activity has been reported over many, many years, like stuff that is basically paranormal in nature consistently is reported in this part of the world. And so he had done a lot of research on the Bermuda Triangle. And so he's primed to hear stories like Gene's story and take them seriously. And so when he heard about Gene's story, he began looking into it. And Vincent pretty much immediately discovered that there was absolutely no record of this enormous ship being on the Platte River. In fact, as Vincent found, it would have been impossible for a ship of that size, as Gene described, this 100-foot ship, being able to travel on the Platte River. It was too shallow. So there was no record, and it seemed impossible. And so the way Vincent responded to this is, okay, well, clearly, Gene is a man who's been racked by guilt and shame. He feels probably like he somehow let his wife down by going out that day, and she winds up dying in this fire. And so this is a man who's just dealing with grief. And it's his grief that has somehow created this story in his mind to explain what happened to his wife. It seems crazy, but people do crazy things when they are really deeply affected by grief. However, many years later, that same journalist wound up finding out that actually Gene was not the only person who had a story like this. He discovered that apparently 25 years before Gene's story and then 16 years after Gene's story, there were these two other people who specifically reported seeing this enormous ship on the Platte River that apparently had the dead body of one of their loved ones on board, and like all the sailors are looking out at them and they're like showing them this dead body, but that person that they're seeing was alive as far as these people thought. But then when they went home, they discovered that their loved ones were in fact dead. It was the same as Gene's story. In the years since these sightings, this ship has become known as the Death Ship, and it's widely considered to be a death omen both in the Platte River Valley and also throughout Wyoming. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. So tonight's story is a classic scary story. It's a great story. It's very unsettling. Got a great plot twist at the end. But this story, it's sort of so unbelievable that I think a lot of people are going to have a hard time actually believing it. But I'll tell you that when this happened, the story happened in Hong Kong, this story got picked up by many major news outlets and was covered extensively. So that suggests there's some real credibility to this story. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide what you actually believe. But before we get into tonight's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, go ahead and sign in to the Follow Button's email account and delete all of their emails. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. One evening in December of 1989, a young waiter named Zhao was bussing a table at the restaurant he worked at in Hong Kong when he heard the restaurant's phone ring. And the sound really stressed Zhao out because the restaurant was really busy that night, and it was only Zhao and one other waiter working along with the manager who was in back. And so Zhao, he's bussing this table. He began looking around for the other waiter to see if maybe they heard the phone and they could go take the call. But he saw the other waiter and she was busy actually taking another table's order. And the manager was, somewhere in back and would not normally take the call anyway. And so Zhao, he sighed and, stopped bussing the table and went over and he picked up the phone. And right away, he can barely hear the person who's talking. It's a voice of what sounds like a very frail older woman, and she's practically whispering into the phone. And so Zhao had to block his other ear because it's so loud in the restaurant, and he's straining to listen, and he's asking this person to speak up. But finally, he can hear, what this woman is calling for. And she's calling because she's trying to place an order for delivery. But this is in the 1980s, so this is before there were things like Uber Eats and, DoorDash. And in Hong Kong at the time, if somebody called in to a restaurant for a delivery order, what it meant was people like Zhao had to take the order and then literally take the food and actually physically bring it to the person who had called it in. So this is sort of a very tedious thing for somebody like Zhao. And so as soon as Zhao could tell that the reason this woman had called was for a delivery order, he's like, oh my goodness, could it get any worse? I have so much to do here. It's so crazy. And now I have to literally run this woman's order to her and then come back and continue my work. Man, what bad luck. But it wasn't like Zhao could do anything else. He couldn't tell the woman no. So, as best as he could, he listened and he told the woman to repeat her order. Let me write down what you want. And so eventually he heard that what she wanted was stir-fried rice noodles with an extra egg, an order of beef chow fun, and a couple servings of fried rice. And then after he took down her order, he told her that he'd be there in about half an hour. And then he hung up. About 15 minutes later, the bell rang in the kitchen. And so Zhao walked over and he saw that the food was ready, the takeout food. And so he grabbed the bag, he grabbed the receipt that showed the address of this woman's apartment, and he stapled it to the bag. And then he found the other waiter who was working that night, and he told her to please look over his tables while he was gone. He'd be right back. And then, with the food in hand, he left the restaurant and began running across the city to get to this apartment. And so he gets outside and he looks at the address and he starts running in the direction of this apartment. And, after several minutes, he gets to the apartment complex. He makes his way up and he finds the door of this woman's apartment. And he knocks on the door and he just waits. And nobody answers the door. And so, he's looking at the time. He knows he needs to get back to the restaurant as soon as possible. He has people that are waiting for him. And so he knocks a bit louder this time and sort of calls out like, "Hey, delivery." No answer. It's still just quiet inside this apartment. And so he looks at the receipt on the bag that, again, shows the address of this woman's apartment to make sure he's at the right one. And he's like, "Yep, I'm definitely at the right apartment." And so after a few more moments of silence, Zhao, he just gives up trying to be polite here. He really needs to get back to the restaurant. And so he just starts wailing on this door, yelling like, "Hey, delivery, like get out here and get your food." And now this time he hears some movement inside of the apartment. And so he stops banging on the door. He hears, the locks being unlocked. And then the door, it opens inwardly, but only a tiny bit, like a crack. And it's dark inside the apartment, and it's bright in the hallway. And so from his perspective, Zhao's looking into this crack and he can't see anything. But eventually, out of this darkness of this little crack, a little hand shows up, and in this hand is money. And through the crack, the hand reaches with the money. And so Zhao, he reaches out, he takes the money, and then a voice comes through the inside of this apartment. And it's that same very quiet, frail voice of the woman who had called and placed the order. And she just said for Zhao to leave the food right there. Just drop it, take the money, and go. And so Zhao, he's thinking how bizarre this is. Like, why is this woman acting the way she's acting? Like, why can't you just open the door all the way and literally take your food inside? Like, you asked me to come here with your food. You basically invited a stranger to your apartment. Like, why would you now be so cagey? It was odd. But at the same time, Zhao didn't really care. She had given him the money, which covered the order, and at this point, he could just leave the food and go back to the restaurant. And so that's what he did. Dropped the food, left the apartment complex, ran back to the restaurant, and continued his night, and basically forgot about this woman. So later that night, after the restaurant had closed, Zhao and the other waitress were cleaning up and getting ready to leave when the manager came out of the back office looking really upset about something. And he sort of strolled over to Zhao and the other waiter, and they both stopped instinctively when they saw the look on his face, and they're sort of looking at him, and he comes in, and sort of out of nowhere, he's like, "I know one of you two has been stealing from this restaurant. I know it." And immediately Zhao, he looks over at the other waiter, and she looks back at him, and they're like, "What?" Like, Zhao knew he did not steal any money. There was no way he was talking about him. And from the looks of it, the other waiter, she definitely did not seem like she, had just been caught stealing. And so the two of them kind of looked back at the manager and they're like, "What are you talking about? Like, we didn't steal from you. Like, what do you mean? Like, what are you talking about?" But the manager was like, "I know one of you did it. I don't know who, but one of you did it. And I'm telling you right now, if it ever happens again, you're fired." And then the manager just turned around and he walked back into his office. And so Zhao and the other waiter are just left standing there like, what just happened? But at the same time, like, Zhao anyways, he knew he didn't take any money. And he's just like, "You know what? I just want to go home. Like, this has been a long day. I want this to be over." And it seemed very much like the other waiter felt the same way. And so the two of them just kind of shrugged and they're like, "I don't know what he's on about, but I didn't do anything." And they finished cleaning up. And then before long, they had left for the night. The next day, Zhao was back at work, and once again, it was extremely busy, and once again, they were understaffed. It was just Zhao and another waiter, a different waiter than the day before, but still, it's just the two of them and the manager who was in the back office. And so it's just another very stressful day, and all day, Zhao, he's thinking about the fact that the manager had effectively accused him of stealing the night before, and that really hadn't been resolved, just from the perspective of the manager hasn't talked about it again, so it's like the elephant in the room. But, at this point, Zhao was just doing his job because, he didn't steal anything. He knew he didn't steal anything, and so he figured it was just a misunderstanding. If it gets brought up again, there's definitely an explanation here. And so all day and into the evening, Zhao's just working like mad, so is the other waiter. And then at some point in the evening, the phone in the restaurant rings. This is in the middle of, the busiest time of the night. And once again, Zhao, like, he's hearing the phone ringing and he's hoping the other waiter is available to take the call because the last thing he wants to do is do another delivery order. But just like the night before, his coworker was busy taking orders from other people. And so it fell on Zhao to take the call. And And so Zhao, he trudged his way through the very busy and very loud restaurant to the phone. He answered it, and immediately he recognized the voice. It was the same woman who had called the night before, the woman he could barely hear. She was talking so quietly. And so again, he had to block his ear to hear what she wanted. And again, she was placing an order for delivery. So again, Zhao would have to be the one to literally go run to her apartment and drop off her food and then hustle back and finish his shift. And so feeling sort of annoyed and a little frustrated because he can barely hear this woman, he's like, hey, can you please repeat your order? Like, I need to write down your order. And so feeling annoyed, Zhao, he took down her order, which was the same as the night before: stir-fried rice noodles with an extra egg, an order of beef chow fun, and a couple servings of fried rice. And then after writing it down, he told her he would see her in about 30 minutes. And then he hung up. And then 15 minutes later, the kitchen bell dings. Zhao walks over, he grabs the bag of food, he attaches the receipt. Out he goes, and he runs across the city over to this woman's apartment, and up he goes. He gets to her door, which he knows is the right one because he had been here the day before, and he pounds on the door right out the gate because apparently this woman takes forever to come to the door. And so he's pounding on the door saying, hey, I'm here, delivery, delivery. And eventually he hears the sound of movement inside the apartment, the sound of locks turning, and then the door opens just a crack, and then out comes a little hand with some money. Zhao, he takes the money just like the day before. He hears the sound of this woman saying to just leave the food outside in the hall. He does just that. He places it down, the door shuts, and Zhao turns, and he leaves, and he goes back to work. Later that night, after the restaurant had closed, Zhao and his other coworker were cleaning up, happy that the day was finally done. And as they're doing that, again, at least from Zhao's perspective, this is the second time this has happened, the manager comes storming out of the back office looking really upset. Now again, the other coworker was not here the night before, but the other coworker could see, like, clearly there's an issue, and Zhao had stopped as well, waiting to hear what the manager had to say. And the manager comes over, but instead of addressing both of them, the manager looks right at Zhao, and he just says, I know it was you. You are the only one who was here yesterday and today, and I'm telling you there is money missing from the register. It's you. You're the one stealing it. Now, Zhao, he knows he didn't take any money from the register. This didn't happen. There's no way that this is true. It can't be true. And so Zhao, he needs this job, and so he can't just, fight with his manager. But he said, that's not possible. I don't know what you're talking about. Can you please explain what you mean? I don't know how this could have happened, but I'm telling you it was not me. Now, the manager, he's sort of staring at Zhao, trying to size him up to see if maybe he's lying or not, and he can't quite tell, and he says to Zhao, well, you know what? The reason I know that somebody is doing this, that this is not some mistake, is because the money from the register is not just missing. It's that the money has been replaced with counterfeit money. Someone is taking money, you, Zhao, and putting counterfeit money back to sort of make it seem like no money is missing. But I know it's counterfeit money. I can spot it. I know it's counterfeit money. You're doing that, Zhao. You did that. You stole from me. And if you don't give the money back, you're fired. And so Zhao, at this point, he's like, what? I didn't do that. I have no idea what you're talking about. There is no way that's true. I did not do that. At this point, the manager just turned around and went into the back office. And then when he came out again, he was holding the counterfeit money and he showed it to Zhao. And right away, Zhao could tell, yeah, that's blatantly counterfeit money. It would never pass as real money. He knew right away what it was. So this was not just typical fake money. It was something known as ghost money. In Hong Kong, some people will literally burn this fake money, this ghost money, at the funeral as sort of an offering. And the belief is that by doing that, this money somehow goes to the deceased person and they can use this money in the afterlife. So it's sort of part of a funeral ritual. And so Zhao knows, this is ghost money. He would recognize it as not real money. And so the idea that this was put into the register to somehow dupe the manager into believing that, don't worry, no one stole any money here, just seems sort of absurd. And so Zhao, he says to the manager, well, wait a minute. I didn't do this, but if I were to take money from the register, I wouldn't have left behind this obviously fake money. I would have just taken the money. I didn't, but why would I put this obviously fake money back in the register? That definitely wouldn't fool you. It didn't. And the manager, he was thinking about it and he was like, yeah, actually, you're right. But then he was like, well, what must have happened then is, you must have accepted this counterfeit money from, a customer and not realized it. Like, this is your mistake. You must have allowed someone to pay with this ghost money and just not noticed it. You're very busy. Maybe that's what happened. And Zhao's like, no, like, there's no way I would have accepted clearly fake money. I would have said, no, this is not real money. Like, there's no way I would have made that mistake. And so the manager's like, well, then how could this money have gotten into the register? Like, were there any strange customers here over the past 2 days? I don't know, like maybe somebody somehow, some way managed to pay with fake money and you didn't notice it or something. Do you have any memory of strange customers or seedy customers over the past 2 days? Now, Zhao, like, he wasn't immediately thinking, oh, I wonder, what criminals I ran into in the last couple of days that maybe paid with counterfeit money. Because, like, in his mind, there was no one like that, like, over the past 2 days. It was just normal people, except he did just immediately think about that woman who had called on both nights and had the same delivery order that he had taken to her apartment. And he thought how weird it was that she had only opened the door a crack and handed out a little bit of money and told him to leave the food on the ground. And like, for just whatever reason, even though in some ways he knew, like, there's no way that woman has anything to do with this counterfeit money, he just found himself telling the manager, he's like, well, actually, there was like this one woman, like, I delivered food to her the past couple of nights, and he sort of described the whole thing and just kind of how weird it was that she would have him leave the food in the hall, and you could barely hear her, and he sort of was confused about the whole thing. And so, like, this didn't explain the counterfeit money at all, but it was like the only weird thing that Zhao could think of. And the manager by this point did believe Zhao. Like, he had sort of changed his tone, and he sort of believed that something weird was going on here, and it wasn't Zhao. Like, he was now sort of working with Zhao to figure it out. And so the manager was just like, okay, well, if this lady calls again, let me deliver the food to her. Let me see if maybe I can talk to her and see if somehow, some way I can figure out if she's the one giving us the counterfeit money. And so the next day, Zhao is back at work, and again, it's a busy day at the restaurant, and all day it's just him and one other coworker, and they're busy all day. And then in the evening, around the same time that this woman had called the past 2 days, the phone rings. And this time, when the phone rings, Zhao immediately runs over and he grabs it. Like, he doesn't care about what he's doing. He was waiting for this call because he was told to, if she calls, hand it over to the manager. And so he picks up the phone, he answers it, and sure enough, it's the same woman, the woman he can barely hear. And she orders the exact same meal to the exact same address. And once again, Zhao takes it down and he says, we'll be there in 30 minutes, and he hangs up. But this time, after giving the order to the kitchen, Zhao went to the back office and he told the manager that, hey, she called again, so the food will be up in about 15 minutes, and if you want to take it over there and see for yourself, you're welcome to. And the manager was like, great, I got it, I'll take it. And so sure enough, about 15 minutes later, the bell rings in the kitchen, the manager goes out, he grabs the food, he looks at the address on the receipt for where this lady lives, and then he leaves the restaurant and he makes his way across town. He gets to the apartment building, he gets up to the door, and he knocks. And after a few moments, there's silence, and so he knocks again, and he checks the receipt again to make sure he's at the right place, and he knows he is. And so he's knocking some more, and he's calling out, delivery, delivery. And eventually, he hears movement inside of the apartment, and he hears the sound of locks turning, and then just the way Zhao described, the door opened just a crack, and then a little hand came through that crack, holding out some money. And for the manager, it actually was pretty disappointing, because for whatever reason, he just felt like, this is going to be it. This person is going to hand me the ghost money, the counterfeit money. This is going to explain it. Maybe it's like a senile old person who's confused and, they're accidentally giving out, the wrong money here. Maybe that's what's going on, and somehow Zhao just didn't recognize it or something, even though he claims he would have seen it, but maybe that's what happened. But no, the money that was coming through the door was definitely real money. And so the manager, he just took the money, and the woman told him to just, leave the food in the hallway, which he did. And then the door shut, and the manager put the money into his pocket. He left the apartment complex, and he walked back to the restaurant. And so later that night, after the restaurant closed, Zhao and his coworker were cleaning the restaurant, and the manager was in the back office counting the money from the register. And as he's counting it, he realizes he's short. Except this time there was no counterfeit money in the till. It was just short. And he's thinking, like, what's going on? He kept checking the receipts. He was looking for maybe money that had been misplaced. But then he remembered that the exact amount that he was short was the money that he himself had collected from the woman at the apartment from the delivery order. And so he reached into his pocket where he'd put the cash and just forgotten, and he pulled it out, and he was about to just, drop it into the till when he gasped, because the money that he had just pulled out of his pocket was ghost money. Like the money that he knew when it had come through the door from this woman, it had been real money. That money that he looked at, confirmed was real, put in his pocket. Now he's looking at it again, and it's ghost money. Like, how can this be? But right at that moment, that's when he realized what must be happening. They were dealing with a professional counterfeiter. She must be using money that has the appearance of real money when it's given to the other party, but then maybe there's paint or something on it that sort of wears off, and it eventually reveals that it's fake money. But by that point, the transaction's already happened and the con is done. And so he's thinking, that's what's going on. That explains the whole thing. That's why Zhao didn't realize it when he was taking this money. It looked real, and it wasn't until later when, whatever they did to the money wore off that it became clear it was ghost money. So at this point, the manager picked up the phone and he called the police. Later that same night, 2 police officers arrived at the apartment complex where this woman who kept ordering delivery food lived. And they made their way up to her apartment, and they knocked on her door, and they called out that it was the police and they were here to talk to her. But nobody answered the door. And so after a few moments, the police knocked again, much louder this time, but still, there was no answer. Nobody came to the door. And it was around this time that the officers noticed there was this horrible smell coming very clearly from this apartment. At first, when they had walked into the hallway, they had sort of smelled it, but they had chalked it up to maybe being just the way the whole building smelled. But no, as they were standing here, it seemed pretty clear that this awful, rotten food smell was coming out of this apartment. And considering the fact that they were here for a potential, counterfeiting ring inside of this apartment, and just the weirdness of the smell and the silence as they're pounding on the door, the officers decided, we got to go in there. We got to see what's going on. And so they kicked the door down. And as soon as they did, they were hit with an even more powerful, horrible smell, like rotting food smell. And they covered their noses, and they went into this apartment. They start calling out, police, police. And it's dark inside the apartments. They can't really see anything. They try the lights, but the lights don't turn on. And they're looking around, and there's a little bit of light coming in through the windows. They can kind of see that it's a small apartment. There's a kitchen, there's a living room, and what appears to be a bedroom over here. And they cut through the kitchen, and they're sort of calling out. They don't see anybody in the apartment. There's no movement whatsoever. And they eventually make their way around to the living room. And by this point, they basically searched the apartment, and there's nobody here. There's no counterfeiting equipment or any sort of criminal operation happening in here. But they eventually get to the living room where the most light was coming in from the outside. And when they looked for the first time really closely at the living room, they realized there was this horrible scene inside of this apartment. There were 4 very decomposed dead bodies sort of lying around the living room. They were draped on the furniture and on the ground, and sort of strewn about the dead bodies were all these wrappers and bags of takeout food, like trash from takeout food. And so the police, after seeing this awful scene, they backed out of the apartment, and a full-scale investigation was launched into what happened here. And ultimately, what they discovered was these 4 people had died because of an accidental carbon monoxide leak inside of this apartment. But the leak had occurred at least a week before their bodies were found. And so that in and of itself created a whole bunch of questions for the police, and certainly for Zhao and his manager, because it's wait a minute, we've been delivering food to this apartment to somebody. Somebody keeps opening the door and handing us this money that is apparently counterfeit money, ghost money. Someone's been doing that, and clearly There are bags of takeout food that were literally the bags that they brought from the restaurant. It turned out it was the same stuff. Like, who's been in here? It doesn't make any sense. Like, there must be somebody else that was maybe in here with the dead bodies or something. However, there was one other truly confounding discovery that had been made already, that was made during the autopsies of these 4 people, that really added a pretty awful twist to the story that, to this day, like, nobody can understand. Nobody has a good explanation for this. And really, this is the reason this story went so viral at the time and was covered by so many news outlets. So in addition to the autopsies discovering that these people died from a carbon monoxide leak, during the autopsies, they cut open the stomachs of each of these 4 people. And you know what they found inside of their stomachs? They found the takeout food. The stir-fried egg noodles, the beef chow fun, the fried rice that was brought over by Zhao and his manager from their restaurant. That was the food inside of their stomachs. And the food was determined to be about maybe 1 or 2 days old. So literally, the food they brought over, these dead people consumed, even though, according to their own autopsies, they were dead by the time the food arrived. And Zhao and his manager would confirm they brought the food over like a day ago. These people would have been dead by then. So how did the food get into their stomachs? Now, to a lot of people, the only explanation here was that whoever ordered the food, whoever called, that frail-sounding older woman who then paid with ghost money, was literally a ghost. The 4 dead people's spirits must have been in some kind of limbo, stuck inside the apartment where they had died, feeling bored and hungry. This incident, which now is just known as the ghost takeaway incident, because takeaway is another word for delivery food, it has been written about extensively in major publications all over Hong Kong, and it's been picked up in other parts of the world. And so there are plenty of people that say, this really happened. This is true. We don't know what to make of it, but it's true. This happened. But other people say this is just an amazing urban legend. It's up to you what you think is really true. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Acasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a very famous story from Thailand. This story was recommended to me by a fan, actually, and I had never heard of it before. But the second I started looking into this, I knew that I had to tell this one, and not just tell it, I had to tell it sitting in front of a campfire. And you'll see why. This is like classic, scary campfire storytelling. But before we get into tonight's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time that you and the follow button are around a campfire together, offer them some nice hot coffee. But don't tell them you've put hot sauce in it. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's story. One morning in the early 1850s, a young man named Mok rowed a small boat through a canal in Phra Kanong, Thailand, which is a very rural community southeast of Bangkok. And Mak was rowing as fast as he possibly could, because where he was going was home and he could not wait to get there. So Mak had been away for almost an entire year by this point. And that was because around a year ago, he'd been drafted into the Thai military and forced to go fight in a war against the neighboring country of Burma. And for Mak, getting drafted had really come at like the absolute worst possible time. Because at the time, his wife, Mae Nak, had been just a couple of months pregnant with their first child. And so he had had to just, basically leave her behind to give birth on her own, which was obviously really difficult for her and for him. Like, he wanted to be there for her and he couldn't. And also, this is 1850s in rural Thailand. So once he was gone, there were no phones or really any way to send letters back and forth. So really, ever since Mak had left, he'd had literally zero communication with his wife. So he has no idea how she's doing, how the baby's doing, nothing. And, he's off fighting in a war. And in fact, he actually got hurt while he was fighting and had to spend months in a military hospital recovering. But his wife had no idea. So Mak rode even faster, and finally, he saw his home in the distance. It was a wooden house that stood on tall stilts right on the edge of the canal with a large balcony that overlooked the water. And it was surrounded by lime trees and thick forest, and it was at least a mile away from the nearest neighbors. So it's a pretty secluded place, but it was a place he desperately missed. As Mak neared the small dock in front of his house, he began excitedly calling out for his wife. And as he did, he began tying up the boat, expecting at any moment to see his wife come running outside with the baby. But his wife didn't. She didn't call back. She didn't come out. It was just quiet. And for a moment, Mak had this horrible thought that maybe something had happened to her while he was gone. Like, how would he know? But then he heard the door open, and out came his wife with a big grin on her face, and she was clutching their baby against her chest. She began calling out to him, and Mak saw there were tears of joy streaming down her face, and he leapt out of the boat and he ran to her. A few days later, Mak woke up inside of his home, and he rolled over in bed and saw his wife still asleep, and he also saw their baby sleeping in a small hammock right beside the bed. And as Mak looked at his little family, he felt almost deliriously happy. I mean, ever since he had gotten home, it was like Mak had entered this just perfect life, like just utter domestic bliss. His baby would turn out to be a boy, which he was really excited about because he had sort of secretly wanted a son. And, over the last couple of days, he had had a chance to basically tell his wife all of his crazy war stories. And she had listened really intently, and she also had gone out of her way to cook him all his favorite meals. And so he was just so grateful to be back here that he literally had not left their home at all since he got back. He just stayed home and just enjoyed this unbelievable homecoming. But on this particular morning, Mak knew he would have to leave because he had to go to the market because their kitchen was basically empty, so they needed food. And so Mak, he climbed out of bed, and as quietly as he could, he got dressed, trying hard not to wake up the baby or his wife. And then when he was ready to actually leave, he walked over to his wife and he gently leaned down and just told her that, hey, I'm going to leave now, I'll be back soon. Now, Mak didn't really expect much of a reaction from his wife. He figured she would just sort of say, okay, see you soon. But no, as soon as she heard he was leaving, it's like her eyes opened wide and she almost looked panicked. And she sat up in bed and she grabbed Mak's arm and she actually shouted, "No!" In fact, she said it so loudly that she woke up their baby. And so the baby's crying, and Mak, at first, he just stared at his wife in total confusion. Like, what is she doing here? And then he said, what's going on? Why do you care so much if I leave? Like, what's wrong? And Mae Nak, his wife, still clutching his arm, she just kept shaking her head saying, "No, you can't leave." And then she looked away like she was trying to find the words or something. And then finally, she looked back at him, and it was clear she had sort of calmed down a little bit. And she said to him that, you've been gone for so long, she just didn't want him to leave again. She said what she wanted him to do was just stay home right here. Don't leave her, don't leave their son, please. Something bad's going to happen if you leave. You've got to stay here. And when Mak heard this, it was actually kind of touching. The idea that his wife was, so protective of him that she didn't want him to leave. He liked that. But, he smiled and he told her, yeah, but somebody has to go get food here. So I'm going to go, I'm going to get us food, I'll be back. in a few minutes. This is not a big deal. And then he gave his wife a hug and a kiss, and she's looking at him like, don't you do this. But he said, look, I'll be back as soon as possible. And then he turned and he left. A little while later, and Mock had arrived at the fruit stand in the market. The market was in the village center, which was a few miles from his house, but he had walked here as quickly as he could because, he had promised his wife he'd be back as quickly as he could. And when Mock went to the man who owned the fruit stand to purchase, the items that he had picked out, the owner of the fruit stand looked at Mock and seemed genuinely surprised to see him. And then he gave Mock an almost sympathetic look and then asked him, like, how are you doing? Now, Mock and the fruit stand owner were not friends, but this village was so small that everybody who lived there knew everybody else. And so, an interaction like this was not unusual. Not to mention the fact that basically everybody knew Mock had gone to war, but they didn't know he had just gotten back. And so Mock assumed that what he was asking about was basically like, hey, I can see you're back from the war. How are you doing? Mock told the owner that, the war had been terrible, but now he was finally home. He was back with his wife and his son. He's so happy to have a son. And so really, despite the war, he'd never been better. His life was perfect right now. But the owner of the fruit stand, when he heard this, he actually looked back at Mock with a pretty confused look on his face and was like, your wife is home? And Mock was like, yeah, of course. Where else would she be? The fruit stand owner was confused for a second and then just sort of shook his head and said, I thought I had heard something different, so I was just confused. And then sort of awkwardly, the fruit stand owner changed the subject and just said, okay, what do you want to buy? Later that morning, Mock returned to his home, now carrying several bags of food. And as he approached his home from a distance, he saw his wife out on the balcony feeding their baby. But from the looks of it, his wife was just sort of staring off into space. Mock called out to her, and it kind of snapped her back to reality, and she turned to him, and she broke into this huge smile. And then she got up, and she walked off the balcony into the house, and then when Mock got inside, she found her waiting for him in the kitchen. And for the most part, she looked really happy and relieved to see him back. It was like, phew, thank goodness nothing happened to you while you were away for 20 minutes. Her panic was gone. She was happy to have him back. And Mock was happy to see her, but at the same time, he also couldn't stop thinking about that strange interaction he had had with the fruit stand owner, how he had been like, oh, your wife's home? It was a question as if he knew something that he wasn't saying. And, Mock was just thinking about it. And so as he put the food away, he told his wife, what the guy had said and how odd it was. And Mock's wife, when she heard this, she got really angry. And she told Mock that this was exactly why she had worried about him leaving the house in the first place. She said that ever since he had left to go to war, people in their village had been talking about her nonstop, spreading all kinds of horrible rumors. And so Mock asked her, what kind of rumors? What are you talking about? But his wife did not elaborate. She just angrily shook her head and then stormed back out onto the balcony. A couple of days later, Mock was out in the forest that surrounded his home, chopping down trees for firewood. He and his wife had not talked any more about the situation with the owner of the fruit stand and, the rumors that people in the town were supposedly spreading about her. Mock was ultimately just sort of puzzled by his wife's behavior. Before he had left for the war, she had always been very logical and independent. And so the fact that she suddenly seemed to care so much about what other people were saying about her, and the way she never wanted Mock to leave her sight, was just odd. The only reasonable explanation Mock could come up with was that, for the last year, his wife had spent a lot of time all alone with a brand new baby and with lots of fear that her husband was never going to come home. That would take a toll on you. And so his hope was that, now that he was home, that she would just, get better. So he was trying his best to just go about his life like normal. But, just that morning when he had told his wife he was going to go out and get some firewood, she had started sobbing and begging him not to go. And it had taken him a full half an hour to calm her down and convince her to let him go because they needed the firewood. And so Mock really didn't know what to make of this. He just hoped that, in time, this would get better. And so Mock just went about his morning, chopping down trees to get some firewood. And at some point, as he was literally chopping down a tree, he heard footsteps coming from behind him. And when he turned around, he sort of half expected to see his wife, but he didn't. He was sort of surprised to see it was this elderly man in a long robe walking directly towards him. Like, clearly, this guy is coming to talk to him. Now, for a second, Mock actually didn't know who this guy was, but then he realized, based on what he was wearing, that he was a monk. And then as he got closer, he could see that it actually is someone who lived and worked at a Buddhist temple in their village. And so this was not a total stranger. In fact, this monk was more like a community leader of sorts. And so as Mock is sort of putting this together, he figured that the reason this guy was coming over was just to, welcome him home from the war. And so Mock lowered his axe and smiled and waved. But the monk didn't smile back. Instead, he walked right up next to Mock, really close to him, and he looked around the forest in sort of a paranoid way, and then in almost a whisper, he asked Mock if he was alone. Mock was definitely weirded out by this and didn't have any idea why this guy was acting this way. But, Mock said, "Yes, I am alone." At this point, the monk seemed to relax, and he told Mock that he really needed to tell him about his wife. And Mock kind of perked up, like, "What are you talking about?" And the monk said that Mock's wife had become convinced that people in their village were spreading rumors about her. And she'd begun going around town terrorizing people to get back at them. At this point, the monk leaned back and gave Mock this expectant look, like he thought maybe Mock was going to apologize for his wife's behavior or something. But to Mock, this information didn't make sense. His wife definitely had talked about people spreading rumors about her, and she was acting pretty strange and paranoid. But to Mock, this information didn't make any sense. On the one hand, his wife had, mentioned that she believed people were spreading these awful rumors about her, so Mock had heard that. But the idea that she was really doing anything about it other than being upset was just false. I mean, how could she be out terrorizing anybody when she literally was at the house with him, like all day long? She couldn't. He was with her. He would have seen it. So, as respectfully as he could, Mock told the monk that he must be confused because there was just no way his wife was acting on any of her suspicions. She might be upset about this stuff, but she's not terrorizing anyone. But the monk just shook his head and told Mock straight up that, "No, you're wrong. Everyone else in the village knew there was something seriously wrong with his wife. Like, everybody knows it. You're the only one who doesn't." And before Mock could say anything else, the monk said to him if he was smart, he would leave his wife right now and he would never look back. And when Mock heard this, he did not believe the monk. Instead, he actually realized that his wife must be telling the truth about how awful everybody was being, spreading these terrible rumors about her. Like, she wasn't being paranoid at all. She had all the reason in the world to think people were out to get her or something. So at this point, Mock dropped the polite act and just told the monk to leave him and his family alone. And then Mock gathered up the wood that he had chopped down and began heading back towards his house. But the next morning, Mock just couldn't get the conversation he had had with the monk out of his mind. I mean, mostly he was just angry at whoever was making up these weird rumors about his wife that was causing, people like the monk and maybe the fruit stand owner to say the weird things they were saying. But also, Mock didn't know what these rumors actually were. He just knew that something was being said about his wife. It was upsetting his wife, but he didn't know what the details were. He figured if he did have the context, have the details, then he could shut the rumors down much more effectively. But he also really didn't want to bring this up to his wife again because he knew it would just really upset her. So he decided that what he needed to do was go back into the village market and go talk to that fruit stand owner. Clearly, he knew more than he was letting on. So that morning, Mock got up and as quietly as he could, he snuck out of the house while his wife and son were still asleep, and he hurried off to the market. And even though it was barely dawn by the time he got there was already a bunch of people that were setting up their stands. However, when Mock made his way over to where the fruit stand had been when he had gone there a couple days earlier, he found it was empty. And for some reason that Mock just couldn't even explain, this immediately gave him a really bad feeling. So instead of waiting around to see if maybe the owner of the fruit stand showed up later, Mock decided he would just go to the guy's house since he knew where he lived. So Mock left the village center and jogged to this guy's house. It was a wooden building up on stilts, just like Mock's house, except it was further away from the canal. When Mock got there, he climbed up a ladder to the porch and then he knocked on the front door. But nobody answered. And so he knocked again, but still there was no answer. And then Mock pressed his ear to the door, but he heard nothing. It was like eerily silent. And at this point, Mock just could not shake this feeling that something was really wrong here, like with the fruit stand owner. So he just reached down and tried the doorknob, and the door swung right open. But as soon as it did, Mock smelled something absolutely rancid inside of this home. And so at this point, Mock, he covered his nose with his hand and continued yelling for the fruit stand owner and began walking slowly into the home, looking around for the guy. But there was no movement inside of the home, and he's calling out over and over again. And then eventually he notices something on the ground. And he looks down and he sees it's the fruit stand owner. And he was just covered in blood and obviously dead. Mock sprinted out of the house, he climbed down the ladder and just began running away as fast as he could. And he knew that what he should be doing is going back to the village center to tell someone about what he had just found. But Mock just couldn't bring himself to do it because he just had this gut feeling that even though he had no idea if his wife was in any way involved with this death, he just felt like based on the rumors and the weird stuff with his wife, that everybody was gonna blame her. So instead of running towards the village center, Mock just began running towards his own house. And when he got close, he slowed down, sort of caught his breath, and he hoped that it was still early enough that his wife and son would still be asleep and he could just sort of sneak back in and, figure out what to do from there, but without alerting his wife and having to explain what was going on. However, just then he was close enough to his house that he could see the balcony that overlooked the water. And he looked up and he saw his wife was clearly awake. She was out on the balcony with the baby on her hip. However, she didn't seem to notice Mock approaching. And so Mock, he's just walking slowly towards the house, thinking, how he's going to explain where he's been to his wife. He figured she's probably upset with him. He didn't know. But he's watching her, and she, again, not aware of Mock, she reaches up and she grabs a lime off a nearby lime tree that was sort of dangling over the balcony. And so she grabs the fruit and she pulls it off the tree and she drops it. She fumbles the lime and the lime falls on the balcony and actually goes and falls between one of the slats on the floorboards. And this balcony is up on stilts, like the whole house is. And so the balcony was 7 feet off the ground. And so when the lime fell through the floorboards, it actually fell 7 feet to the ground below. And so Mock, he's watching this happen, and this is not like some meaningful event to him. He's just sort of, clocking that she's dropped this lime, and he's thinking she's gonna, grab a different lime, right? But no, he watched as his wife sort of almost robotically kneeled down and then put her arm into the slat that this lime had fallen through. Again, she still has not seen Mock yet. And he watched as her arm began to stretch away from her body, and down her arm went. It stretched nearly 7 feet until her hand grabbed the lime on the ground. And then her arm was making these horrible crackling sounds as it retracted back up through the floorboards. And then she had her lime. And it was at that point that she turned and looked at Mock. Mock, at this point, was horrified, and he just turned and ran. And this time, he went directly to the center of the village, to the Buddhist temple, where that monk had come from, the one that had basically tried to warn him about his wife. And so Mock, he begins pounding on the door of this temple, begging the monks to let him inside and to hide him from his wife. And eventually the doors open, the monks immediately let him inside, and they do hide him. And for a little while, he's just beside himself, Mock. He can't even process what he just saw. He's telling himself that, that couldn't have happened. Her arm couldn't have stretched that far, but it looks so real. He couldn't reconcile what he had just experienced. And the monks, for the most part, just kind of let Mock have his moment of just being totally upset. But then eventually, when Mock kind of calmed down, the monk who had originally come to him to warn him about his wife, he came over to Mock. And he said, I gotta tell you the truth about your wife. But they told Mock that in order to do that, Mock was going to have to agree to do something that was going to be incredibly painful. They would need him to allow them to exhume his beloved wife's long dead corpse. It would turn out that what everyone in the village knew, but Mach did not know, was that his wife and son had both died during childbirth while he was away in the war. His wife's body had literally been in the ground for months, but apparently her ghost was still around and very attached to Mach and would not let anybody get between them. It was not until Mach did give the monks permission to exhume his wife's body that they could finally stop this haunting. And so the monks ultimately carved out a circular-shaped piece of her skull and performed a Buddhist ritual to trap her spirit inside the bone. Today, in Prakanong, the village where Mach and his wife and his son had lived, is now home to a permanent shrine to Mae Nak. She's seen by some as a very dangerous and terrifying ghost, and by others as a symbol of love that is so powerful it transcends death. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Karis Pash Cooper. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.